In this video, you're going to hear the full story of Jason and the legendary Golden Fleece. From the very beginning to the tragic end, everything is here, including the epic journey of the Argonauts. It's all connected, so sit back and relax. This is the complete tale. If you enjoy mythology and calming storytelling, make sure to subscribe for more myth and sleep content. Princess Helle and Prince Phrixus lived in a grand palace made of white marble, surrounded by luxury, with fine clothes, delicious food, toys, and friendly faces everywhere. At their command, servants rushed to bring them anything they desired, whether it was figs, honeyed bread, or their little donkey chariot. By all appearances, they should have been the happiest children in all of Greece. But ever since their stepmother Ino had entered their lives, everything had gone wrong. Ino was harsh, always finding faults, walking around with her two sons while scolding and changing things, and never pleased with anything Helle or Phrixus did. No matter how quietly they tried to avoid her, by hiding behind the palace's tall columns or escaping into the gardens, they always ended up being yelled at. One day, when they accidentally broke a jar and tried to fix it, Ino screamed at Helle and called her wicked, and when the two children couldn't help but laugh nervously, Ino grew even more furious, shouting so loudly the dogs barked and the slaves came running. In a rage, she demanded that they be taken away from her sight. Phrixus and Helle hated her deeply. That day, Phrixus sat upstairs on his bed, covering his ears and shutting his eyes, trying to block out the memory of her angry face and the awful noise of her voice. But no matter how hard he tried, her screaming filled the house. She accused King Athamas, Phrixus's father, of favoring his children while ignoring her own. Although Athamas tried to treat all the children fairly, Ino refused to believe it. She blamed everything on Phrixus and Helle, even the kingdom's failing crops. The once loving woman Athamas had married had become someone unrecognizable, loud, cruel, and accusing. In her fury, she even claimed that the gods were punishing them because of the children's bad behavior and urged Athamas to ask the oracle for the truth. And in truth, the land was suffering. The crops had failed even though the fields had been worked as always. Seeds had been planted and watered, but nothing grew, and winter was coming with the granaries nearly empty. People were scared, hungry, and desperate, thinking the gods were angry. But what no one knew was that the gods were not to blame. It was Ino who had done this. Out of jealousy and spite, convinced that Athamas loved his first wife's children more than hers, she had secretly ruined the seeds months earlier. She told her maids to light fires under the grain in the granaries, knowing the smoke would spoil them. Now, her plan was unfolding as she wanted. Athamas, desperate to help his starving people, agreed to send messengers to the oracle at Delphi, hoping for a solution. But Ino acted fast. She intercepted the messengers before they reached the palace and paid them to lie. When they arrived, they told a terrible false message, that the oracle had demanded Phrixus and Helle be sacrificed to Zeus to stop the famine. Athamas was frozen in horror as they repeated Ino's lie and handed him a shining knife, insisting he take the children to Mount Laphystium and kill them. They claimed that only then would Zeus, the king of the gods and protector of mankind, allow the crops to grow again. He could summon storms in seconds, crush cities with a single thunderbolt, and make the earth spin out of control if he wanted. No one ever disobeyed Zeus. So when Athamas heard the supposed command from the oracle, manipulated by Ino's lies, he felt he had no choice but to obey. In a flat voice, he ordered the children to be ready at dawn. As the sun rose, Athamas led Phrixus and Helle up Mount Lephistium, carrying his hunting gear and the deadly knife meant for sacrifice. He told them they were going hunting. Helle skipped behind, picking flowers and enjoying the peaceful morning, unaware of her father's heavy heart. The steep path wound through the rocks, and Athamas, silent and burdened, watched his children play and laugh. The king struggled with the horrifying thought of what he was about to do. He questioned how a god like Zeus could demand such cruelty. His hand gripped the knife's handle as he imagined the impossible choices, who to sacrifice first and how to spare the other from watching. He thought of Helle's trusting eyes and the joy in her voice, knowing it would all vanish if he went through with it. Yet, with famine spreading across the land, he feared for his people and told himself that this was the only way to bring back the crops. Turning his eyes toward the sunlit plains of Boeotia, he saw only dry, barren fields where golden corn should have grown, and with a heavy sigh he whispered that Zeus must be obeyed. As he gathered stones for an altar, Helle sat nearby, singing and making a flower garland, unaware of what her father planned. Athamas decided he would sacrifice her first, so she would not see her brother die. When she skipped down the path toward him, curious and cheerful, he tried to keep his voice low as he chanted the sacred words, hoping not to frighten her. Far away, high on Mount Olympus, Zeus, who could hear the softest sounds on earth, heard his name spoken from the mountain. He looked toward Mount Lephistium and saw a boy playing, a girl skipping, and a man building an altar with a knife. Zeus shook his head in frustration. People always misunderstood him. He hated human sacrifice, and now someone was about to kill children in his name. At that moment, Ohe, Hera, and Nephele arrived. Nephele, Helle's mother, had been watching from the sky and was horrified by what Athamas was preparing to do. Hera comforted her, and Zeus quickly acted. He ordered Hermes to fetch the golden ram from Mycenae without delay. Hermes flew off, sandals flashing, racing against time. Back on the mountain, Athamas finished the altar, poured wine over it, and gently lifted Helle onto the stones. She thought it was just a game and smiled as she lay down. Athamas, trying not to cry, raised his hands to the sky and called out to Zeus one last time. Then, taking the knife, he raised it high above his head, ready to strike. Helle, now sensing something was wrong, saw the blade shining in the sunlight and screamed. Just as Athamas raised the knife to sacrifice Helle, Phrixus came running down the path and froze in shock as the sunlight glinted off the blade. Horrified, he cried out, and for a moment Athamas hesitated, his tear-filled eyes locked on his son. Helle lay paralyzed with fear, staring at the knife above her, when suddenly a great shadow passed over them. Floating just above the ground was a golden ram, its shining fleece glowing in the sun. A voice urged Helle to climb on, and she grabbed the thick wool and pulled herself up. Phrixus begged to come too, and quickly scrambled onto the ram's back. Hermes, invisible beside them, gave a final instruction to hold tight before disappearing. Athamas could only watch in disbelief as the children soared over him and vanished into the sky. The golden ram carried them higher and higher, out over the mountains and sea, past scattered islands and shining blue waters. At first, silent with shock, Phrixus finally asked where they were going, but the ram had no voice, and Hermes had already returned to Olympus. Helle, beginning to feel safe, started to enjoy the wild ride, laughing as they flew through clouds and startled birds. She clapped her hands with joy when the ram began to dive swiftly toward a narrow strip of sea. But in that moment of excitement, she lost her grip. Screaming, she fell, her hair streaming behind her, and disappeared into the waves below. That place became known as the Hellespont, Helle's Sea, in her memory. Phrixus, devastated and frightened, clung tightly to the ram as it carried him farther across lands he had never seen, until at last it landed in the kingdom of Colchis. There, King Ait welcomed him with open arms, for the golden ram was a divine sign of royal favor. The king said the ram must be sacrificed to Zeus as thanks, and its shining fleece would be placed in the sacred grove of Ares. The next day, they performed the ceremony, and the fleece was hung on an oak tree, guarded forever by a huge, watchful dragon. News of the children's escape and the golden ram spread quickly, and back in Boeotia, the truth finally came out. One messenger confessed that Ino had paid them to lie about the oracle's message, and her maids admitted they had ruined the seed on her orders. With her plot exposed, Ino fled and threw herself from a cliff into the sea. Hera and Nephele begged Zeus to punish Athamas as well, but he believed the king had suffered enough. Instead of death, Zeus exiled Athamas, who wandered alone until he eventually found love again and raised a new family. The people of Boeotia barely survived the hard winter, but the next year, Demeter blessed them with a rich and early harvest. Phrixus remained in Colchis, where he married Chalciope, the king's daughter. He often passed the grove where the dragon guarded the fleece and thought of the day the golden ram saved him and his sister, remembering Hele's fall with sadness. Many years later, a young Greek hero named Jason would travel from Thessaly to try and bring the golden fleece back home. Jason sat near the fire inside the mountain cave where he had grown up, knowing that this day was different. Today he would finally learn the truth about who he was. He had spent 18 years under the care of Chiron, the wise centaur who had raised him like a father, teaching him music, healing, hunting, poetry, and combat. Jason could identify every mountain herb, recite heroic tales, shoot arrows with perfect aim, and play the lyre so sweetly that animals paused to listen, but he knew nothing of his real parents. Chiron had always promised to reveal everything when the time was right, and now, as the rain poured outside and the fire crackled in the cave, the moment had come. Chiron, glowing in the firelight, finally spoke, telling Jason that his real name was Diomedes, and that he was the son of Aeson, the rightful king of Iolcus, a city Jason could sometimes see far below from the cliffs of Mount Pelion. His mother's name was Polymele, and he had been born into danger. On the day of his birth, Aeson's throne had been stolen by his half-brother Peleus, who had been warned by an oracle that he would die at the hands of a descendant of Iolus. Determined to protect Jason, Polymele faked her baby's death and secretly sent him to Chiron to be raised in safety. Meanwhile, Peleus had thrown Aeson into the darkest dungeon and swore to kill every one of his children. Jason listened in silence, trying to process the truth about his past. He asked about his parents and learned his father was still imprisoned and his mother still trapped at the palace, while Peleus continued to rule. Filled with sudden fire, Jason grabbed a spear and demanded to know what he should do. But Chiron, ever calm, told him to wait until morning. Then, slipping into a trance, Chiron began to rock and hum as he saw visions of the future, of Jason's fame, his long journey, great suffering, and perhaps even a crown. When Jason begged for more answers, Chiron had returned to his usual quiet mood and said no more. At dawn, Jason prepared to leave the only home he had ever known. He dressed in a leather tunic, slung a leopard skin over his shoulders, strapped on sandals, and armed himself with 2 spears and a staff. After eating the bread and honey that Chiron gave him, and listening to his final directions, he said goodbye to the centaur and began his journey down the steep path to the valley. Chiron stood at the cave entrance watching him go, smiling with pride. He had raised many great warriors. Achilles, Castor, and Polydeuces had all taken that same path and become legends. As Jason disappeared into the fresh spring morning, Chiron felt sure that this young man too was destined for greatness. The sky was clear as Jason made his way down the wet mountain paths, whistling and swinging his staff through the undergrowth, sending birds fluttering into the air. He soon reached a sunny meadow filled with yellow flowers Chiron had called King's Spears, where crickets chirped, larks sang, and the sound of goat bells echoed from the hills. Jason walked all morning, and by midday he reached the pine-scented foothills where the path leveled out. As he entered the valley, heading for Iolcus, he heard a growing roar ahead and soon saw the river Anorus. Not a calm stream as Chiron had described, but a raging torrent, swollen from last night's rain and melting mountain snow. The path continued on the far bank, but the bridge, if there had been one, was gone. Sitting by the river and eating his bread, Jason was startled by a tap on his shoulder. Behind him stood an old woman, bent over a stick, dressed in rags. She asked for help crossing the river, and though unsure how he would even cross himself, Jason offered to carry her. He strapped on his gear and lifted the frail woman onto his back. But as he stepped into the freezing water, he found the current much stronger than he'd expected. With each step, the old woman seemed heavier until she felt like a lead weight. Jason struggled to keep his footing on the slippery riverbed, nearly drowning in the middle of the torrent. But he pressed on, inch by inch, until he grabbed a tree root and dragged them both to the far bank. Exhausted, he set her down gently and collapsed, gasping for breath, only to realize moments later that she had vanished. Unbeknownst to Jason, the old woman had been the goddess Hera in disguise. Angered that Peleus in Iolcus was planning a festival for Poseidon and had forgotten her, Hera wanted a mortal ally. Jason had just proven himself, passing her secret test with courage and kindness. She had even made herself weigh as much as 2 centaurs to see if he would drop her, but he had not faltered. Now, from Mount Olympus, she looked down with approval at the soaked young man trying to clean the weeds from his clothes. Jason, unaware of any of this, noticed he had lost one of his sandals in the river. He searched along the bank, but it was gone. Shrugging it off, he gathered his things and continued the journey, barefoot on one side. His toughened, mountain-trained feet managed the path well, and the sun quickly dried his clothes. He chewed on the last of his soggy bread and a few berries he found on the way, enough to ease his hunger. The rest of the walk was quiet, and Jason pressed forward, focused only on reaching Iolcus, not knowing that losing his sandal would soon fulfill a prophecy Peleus feared. After walking all day, Jason finally collapsed in an old shepherd's hut just as the sun set, falling asleep to the soft sounds of owls and lambs nearby. By mid-morning, he reached the bustling marketplace of Iolcus. Amazed by the towering buildings and the crowds of people whose chatter filled the square, his golden hair and confident stride caught everyone's attention. But Jason couldn't understand why people stared at him, then whispered behind their hands. At a fish stall, he asked a vendor what the fuss was about, and the man explained it was because of his single sandal. An oracle had once warned King Peleus that he would lose his kingdom to a man wearing only one sandal. Now it all made sense to Jason, who had lost his sandal crossing the river. He thanked the man and walked straight to the palace. By the time he arrived, news of the one-sandaled stranger had already reached Peleus, who was waiting and sneered when Jason demanded the throne. Peleus told him his father Aeson was dead, which was a lie, and said that if Jason truly thought himself worthy of ruling Iolcus, he must first prove it. Knowing the people were watching and that Jason's presence had stirred memories of Aeson's rightful rule, Peleus couldn't risk throwing him in prison, so he came up with a deadly challenge to eliminate him. He ordered Jason to bring him the golden fleece from the distant land of Colchis, fully expecting him to die trying. Peleus knew the journey would be long and full of danger, and that the fleece was guarded by a huge fire-breathing dragon and fiercely protected by King Ates. Jason stood in the hall surrounded by curious and expectant faces, and his mind returned to the fireside stories Chiron had told him about Phrixus and Helle, and to the vision the wise centaur had shared. A long journey, pain, glory, and a crown. Jason realized that this was his moment, his chance to claim his birthright and become the hero he was meant to be. He looked directly at Peleus and said without hesitation that he would bring back the golden fleece. Jason knew the journey to Colchis would be long and dangerous, far too difficult to face alone. So messengers were sent out across Greece, shouting in every market square that crew members were needed for an expedition to retrieve the golden fleece. The quest would take them across the Black Sea, through waters ruled by an angry sea god and filled with monsters and deadly whirlpools. Heroes and adventurers from all over came running, and it wasn't long before Jason was surrounded by eager men offering their strength and skills. Among them was the mighty Heracles, strongest man in the world and son of Zeus, whose presence amazed everyone. Then came Atalanta, a fierce warrior, the best archer and fastest runner in the land. Zetes and Calais, the winged sons of the north wind, joined too, able to fly like arrows. Castor and Polydeuces, Olympic champions in wrestling and boxing, were also chosen. Jason named Nauplius as navigator, Tiphys as helmsman, and Lynceus as lookout, whose eyes were sharp enough to spot an ant from miles away. Echion, the son of Hermes, was appointed herald, and Orpheus, the famous poet and musician, promised to play his magical lyre, whose music could calm even wild beasts. Many others with incredible abilities joined as well. One who understood animals, another who could run on water, and Periclymenus, who could change into any form he wished. Altogether, 53 heroes were selected, including Acastus, the son of King Peleus, who had no choice but to let him go, or risk showing that he believed the mission would fail. While Jason gathered his crew, a skilled builder named Argus was hard at work by the sea, crafting the ship that would carry them. He didn't work alone. Athene, goddess of wisdom and war, helped from the start. She traveled to Mount Pelion, chose the finest spruce for the mast, and taught Argus how to make the ship strong and perfect in every detail. The hull was sealed tight, the sail woven from the best linen, and each oar carved smooth and balanced. As a gift, Athene fixed a piece of her father Zeus's sacred oak from Dodona into the prow of the ship, giving it the power to speak like a human. When the ship was completed, she named it the Argo, then vanished back to Mount Olympus before the crew arrived. When the heroes gathered to see the Argo, they were amazed and full of praise for Argus. Jason stood proudly at the prow and welcomed them aboard, calling them the Argonauts, the chosen crew for the quest. As they laughed and admired the ship, Jason reminded them that ahead lay unknown dangers, and warned that anyone who doubted their courage should step away now. As Jason stood before the gathered Argonauts on the deck of the Argo, he reminded them that this was their last chance to turn back if they were unsure about the journey ahead, but no one stepped forward to leave. He then told them it was time to choose a captain. The younger men looked toward Heracles, expecting the legendary warrior to take command, but Heracles calmly refused, saying there was only one man fit to lead, Jason, the one who had accepted the challenge in the first place. His words were met first with whispers, then a growing wave of applause until the entire crew cheered as Jason returned to the prow with a broad smile. On Mount Olympus, Hera, pleased that Heracles was not chosen, expressed her approval to Athene, relieved that Jason would lead the voyage. That afternoon, Jason worked harder than anyone else, helping haul equipment onto the ship and dragging the Argo down to the water. At sunset, they offered sacrifices to Apollo, and then celebrated with a feast on the beach, as Orpheus played his lyre. Jason, unaware that Hera and Athene were watching, quietly offered a personal prayer to the gods, hoping for success. They all fell asleep under a starry sky, and at dawn were awakened by the magical prow calling them aboard. The sky was painted in the soft pink of morning, and among the crowd waving goodbye were Jason's mother, Polymele, and the centaur Chiron. Though she had just reunited with her son, Polymele showed only pride as she watched the ship glide away into the mist. Once clear of the bay, the Argo's sail caught the wind and they sped forward, the rowers finally able to rest. Dolphins danced beside the ship, and Melampus, who could understand animals, said they were wishing the Argonauts good luck. For 4 days they sailed across the Aegean, stopping at islands each night. On the 5th evening, the wind died just as the sun set, and they rowed toward the island of Lemnos. As they neared the rocky shore, Lynceus, the sharp-eyed lookout, spotted armed warriors waiting. The sunset gleamed off their bronze helmets, and they raised spears and swords threateningly. Heracles jumped up with excitement, ready to fight, and Atalanta reached for her bow, but Jason stopped them, signaling Echion the herald to come forward and speak for them. As the Argo neared the shores of Lemnos, Jason ordered his crew to try talking before resorting to weapons, and although Heracles and Atalanta were disappointed, they obeyed. Typhus guided the ship gently onto the beach as a group of warriors approached, and Echion called out that they meant no harm and were simply seeking shelter and water on their journey to retrieve the golden fleece. The islanders murmured in response, and then a woman's voice welcomed them. The Argonauts disembarked and quickly realized all the warriors were women. The leader introduced herself as Queen Hypsipyle and explained that they had mistaken the Argo for an enemy Thracian ship. The weary crew eagerly accepted the women's offer of food, enjoying roast boar and wine under a sky filled with laughter and music. But what Jason didn't know was the dark secret of Lemnos. The women had once neglected Aphrodite and were cursed with a terrible stench that drove their husbands away to Thrace. Enraged, the women had seized weapons, killed all the men, including the king, and driven off the Thracian women, except for Hypsipyle's father, whom she had spared and set adrift. Now, with the curse lifted, the women of Lemnos were looking for new husbands and a new king. Their generous hospitality was meant to encourage the Argonauts to stay forever. Most of the crew, worn from rowing and tempted by comfort, gladly accepted this idea, and Jason, who was spending much of his time with Hypsipyle, seemed to forget the mission altogether. But by the 4th day, Heracles grew restless and dragged Atalanta to the beach for archery practice near the empty ship. As they fired arrows into a piece of driftwood, they discussed how something felt strange about Lemnos. Heracles shared a servant story about mistreated women driving off the men, which both of them found suspicious. Laughing, Heracles joked that the women wanted new husbands, to which Atalanta replied that husbands were nothing but trouble. Meanwhile, Queen Hypsipyle offered Jason the throne of Lemnos if the Argonauts agreed to stay and marry the island's women. Jason, though tempted by the offer, said he would return after completing his quest. But at that very moment, Heracles and Atalanta stormed into the palace and insisted the Argonauts leave Lemnos immediately, with Heracles voicing his frustration that there was no glory to be won on an island of feasting and idleness. Jason, though clearly reluctant and still emotionally attached to Queen Hypsipyle, agreed it was time to go and solemnly promised he would return to marry her, though he never did. Only much later would the Argonauts learn the dark truth of Lemnos and realize how narrowly they had escaped a deadly trap. Still, as they said their farewells, many were genuinely saddened to leave the women who had cared for them. But out at sea, Heracles and Atalanta were relieved, and the crew's minds quickly shifted to a far more serious challenge ahead: the dangerous journey through the Hellespont, a narrow and treacherous channel guarded by the Trojans and forbidden to Greek ships since the Trojan War by King Laomedon. Attempting the crossing meant risking everything, as being caught would mean death. They planned to slip through under the cover of night, and as they neared the channel, a strong wind from the south began to blow. All lamps were snuffed out, and the rowers wrapped their oars in linen to soften their strokes. It was a pitch-black, cloudy night, with no moon to guide them, and Lynceus, with his extraordinary eyesight, sat perched at the prow trying to make out the cliffs and headlands that framed the channel. Jason gave the signal. The sail was braced, and the rowers pulled with all their strength as the Argo cut through the choppy, inky waters of the Hellespont, dwarfed by the dark cliffs that towered on either side. The creaking of the mast and the splash of each oar seemed impossibly loud in the silence, and no one dared speak as they passed through enemy waters. When they finally cleared the Hellespont and slipped into the Propontis, known today as the Sea of Marmara, the crew only whispered brief prayers of relief and turned to the task ahead. With the wind behind them and a vast unknown sea stretching out before them, they pressed on toward the east, ready to face whatever dangers lay beyond. "Nothing but feasting and parties," Heracles grumbled as he rowed the Argo alongside Atalanta and Typhus toward the Dolionians' port, still frustrated that their journey hadn't given him the excitement he craved. Earlier that morning, the Argonauts had landed on the southern shore of the Propontis, where they were warmly greeted by King Cyzicus, who was in the middle of celebrating his wedding to Princess Clyte. The king had invited them to the feast and suggested they move the Argo to the city port at the foot of Mount Dindymum for safety. So while the rest of the crew went ahead to the wedding, Heracles, Atalanta, and Typhus brought the ship around the coast. Heracles still complaining that the Hellespont crossing hadn't been thrilling enough, right up until a massive wave slammed into his face, knocking him onto the deck. Before Atalanta could react, a giant boulder came crashing into the sea near the Argo, launching another wave that tossed the ship sideways and sent her flying under a bench. As she scrambled to her senses, she found Heracles dazed beside her with a bleeding head, and as they looked up, they realized they were under attack by 6-armed giants tearing chunks off the mountain to throw into the sea. The Argo rocked violently as more waves pounded it, and Atalanta, half drenched and furious, shouted that this had better be exciting enough for Heracles, who, ignoring the chaos, grabbed his spear, stood, and hurled it into one of the giants. It struck true, and the massive figure tumbled down the mountain. Atalanta followed with an arrow that pierced another between the eyes, sending its towering body crashing into the sea. Tiphys joined in, and the three of them launched a fierce counterattack. Caught off guard, the remaining giants hesitated just long enough for the Argonauts to pick them off one by one, their massive forms falling like trees into the sea. With the threat gone, they rowed safely to shore and waited for their crewmates. When the others arrived, they were disappointed to have missed the fight, though Atalanta was even more disappointed to learn she had missed a grand feast of roast deer, wild boar, seafood, and endless wine, which Acastus declared absolutely delicious between hiccups. King Cyzicus and part of the wedding party came to the port to see them off, the Argonauts exchanging cheers and stories, each group slightly jealous of what the others had experienced. King Cyzicus, still dressed in his wedding robes with a lion skin draped over his tunic, looked uneasily at the giant corpses floating near the shore and explained to Jason that the giants normally left them alone, thanks to Poseidon, who was supposed to keep them in check, though they had always been unpredictable like the god himself. After wishing Jason luck, the king returned to his city, while the Argonauts boarded the Argo and set off between the dead giants. Once at sea, Nauplius charted an eastward course, and they sailed peacefully until nightfall, when the weather suddenly turned. Strong winds from the sea god whipped up a violent storm, driving the ship back toward land. Acastus, sick from the feast, vomited overboard, and many others were just as pale and queasy, regretting the heavy food and wine. Only Atalanta seemed unaffected, cheerfully mocking the panic, while Heracles, usually fearless, clutched his stomach and remained silent, green-faced. Blown ashore in darkness and rain, the Argonauts grabbed their weapons, only to be met with a terrifying war cry and a rain of spears. Atalanta shouted that they were under attack again. Forgetting their seasickness, the crew jumped onto the beach to defend themselves. A brutal clash followed. Shields rang, arrows flew, warriors shouted in rage and pain. Heracles rampaged furiously, felling enemies with each swing, and Jason, with a thunderous cry, pierced the enemy leader's heart with his spear, sending the man falling into the surf. The remaining attackers fled in panic. The exhausted Argonauts spent the rest of the stormy night huddled on the sand, unsure of where they had landed, fearing another ambush. At dawn, Castor ran along the beach shouting, his face pale with horror and a soaked lion skin in his hands. Jason rushed to him, and Castor revealed the shocking truth. King Cyzicus was dead. In the chaos of the storm, they had unknowingly returned to the land of the Dolionians, and Jason had killed the king himself in battle. Not recognizing him in the darkness, the lion skin made it heartbreakingly clear, and Jason was left overwhelmed with guilt and sorrow at the terrible mistake they had made. Jason dropped to his knees on the blood-soaked beach, screaming in anguish as he realized the horrible truth, that the bodies lying around him were those of the Dolionians who had waved them off only a day earlier. He beat the sand with his fists, overwhelmed with guilt, while Heracles rushed over, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder and saying the only thing he could. They had no way of knowing. Back in the city, the few surviving Dolionians believed they had been attacked by pirates, unaware that it had been the Argonauts who killed their king. But when the Argonauts, filled with sorrow, brought back the bodies of their fallen comrades, the truth became clear, though too late to stop the grief. Queen Clyte, King Cyzicus's new bride, had already taken her own life, hanging herself from an oak tree in the forest when she heard the news. For 3 days, both the Argonauts and the Dolionians mourned, burying Cyzicus and Clyte as thunder roared and the storm continued to rage. Gods and goddesses came down to grieve, and it was said the wood sprites cried so hard that a spring formed from their tears and was named after Clyte. But the winds didn't stop. For 12 more days and nights the storm raged, and the Argonauts grew restless, trapped and frustrated despite prayers, offerings, and sacrifices to Zeus, Apollo, and Poseidon. The reason for the storm finally came one night when most of the crew was asleep, and only Acastus and Mopsus were keeping watch. A small bird, a kingfisher, flew above Jason and perched near the boat, singing in a high, sharp voice. Mopsus, who could understand birds, listened closely and then shook Jason awake. The bird carried a message from Rhea, the mother of Poseidon, who was furious that her 6-armed giant brothers had been killed by the Argonauts. She had created the storm to punish them, and had also ensured Cyzicus's death because he had once killed her sacred lion during a hunt on Mount Dindymum. To calm her anger, Mopsus said, they needed to make a sacrifice to her. At dawn, Jason led a group of Argonauts up the mountain, pulling an old goat behind him, while Argus carved a figure of Rhea from a vine stump. They built an altar at the summit, poured wine on it, called out to Rhea, and begged her to end the storm. Then they made the sacrifice. The moment the goat died, the mountain came alive. Flowers bloomed on every rock, trees burst into blossom, and a fresh stream gushed from the earth. The wind dropped, the sky cleared, and Rhea was satisfied. As the sun rose and the mountain glowed in spring light, the Argonauts returned to the beach with hope in their hearts. At last, they were free to continue their journey. While rowing through the calm waters of the Propontis, Heracles suddenly proposed a competition to see who could row the longest. This idea was unusual for Heracles, who was better known for his strength than his cleverness, and Orpheus even whispered to Castor in disbelief. Jason asked what the challenge was, and Heracles loudly declared the contest to test endurance. Orpheus quickly made clear he would not participate, but many other Argonauts eagerly joined in, and soon the Argo sped through the water accompanied by the enchanting music of Orpheus's lyre. Hours passed, and one by one the rowers gave out, leaving only Jason and Heracles still rowing, though Jason was nearing collapse. Near the mouth of the river Chius, Jason finally gave in with a groan of pain and frustration, conceding defeat to Heracles. Just then, a loud crack broke the tension. Heracles' massive oar snapped in two. He stumbled but kept gripping the broken stump as the blade floated away in the current, cursing loudly before flinging the useless piece aside. Jason lay laughing and gasping for breath on the deck. The others recovered enough to bring the ship to a nearby beach, where they prepared their evening meal. Meanwhile, Heracles went into the forest with an axe to find wood to make a new oar, and his servant Hylas set off to fetch water with a pitcher. Hours passed, and Heracles sat on the beach with his new oar, but Hylas had not returned. Concerned, Heracles sent a young rower named Polyphemus to search for him. Darkness was falling, and Heracles grew worried about his servant, who was almost like a son to him. With an oil lamp in hand, Heracles plunged back into the forest, calling out, "Hylas! Hylas!" His voice was answered by Polyphemus, who soon appeared breathless, holding Hylas's pitcher. Polyphemus reported that he found the pitcher near a pool, but saw no signs of struggle or danger. Heracles turned the pitcher in his hands, grimly noting that if Hylas had been attacked by an animal, there would have been blood. They searched the area by the dim lamplight, but found no trace of Hylas. What they did not know was that Hylas had encountered a very different fate. At that moment, the pool was home to a group of nymphs who gathered to sing to their goddess Artemis. These beautiful, magical women lived in caves, woods, and waters, and many mortals had fallen under their spell. As Hylas knelt by the pool's edge to fill his pitcher, one nymph surfaced and instantly fell in love with his handsome face. As he bent closer to the water, she reached through the weeds, grabbed his arms, and with a swift, strong pull, dragged him beneath the surface, down through the slimy weeds and swirling waters, into her watery realm deep below. Hylas disappeared forever beneath the waves. Unaware of this, Heracles and Polyphemus ran back to the beach, shouting his name into the darkness. After alerting the rest of the Argonauts, everyone spread out to search for the missing boy, hoping to find him before it was too late. All night long and well into the morning, the Argonauts searched desperately for Hylas, with Heracles charging about like a furious bull, roaring his servant's name and refusing to give up. Despite Jason's gentle orders to prepare to leave, Heracles insisted he would not abandon the search, insisting that he owed Hylas's mother at least the dignity of finding his body. As the Argo slowly pulled away from the shore, Heracles remained on the beach, shouting into the empty air. This loss caused a fierce division among the crew. Many of the younger Argonauts accused Jason of abandoning Heracles out of jealousy, claiming that Heracles should have been their leader and demanding they return to bring him back. Tensions erupted when a hot-headed archer named Telamon lunged for the helm to seize control, but he was stopped by Zeus and Calais, leading to chaos as some Argonauts refused to row and brandished their weapons, shouting wildly and causing the Argo to drift uncontrollably, pitching dangerously from side to side. Suddenly, the waters behind the ship parted, and an enormous hand gripped the stern, followed by a massive shaggy head and another hand clutching a giant trident. The legendary sea god Poseidon emerged up to his waist, silencing the crew instantly with his thunderous voice, declaring that it was the will of Zeus that Jason's decision stood firm and that Heracles was destined for other tasks beyond their voyage. The god warned them not to meddle with fate and proclaimed that Hylas was now the husband of a nymph, chosen and forever lost to them. As Poseidon released his grip, he plunged back beneath the waves, causing a furious whirlpool to form, pulling the Argo into a deadly spiral. The Argonauts were paralyzed with fear, helplessly watching as their ship was dragged toward the vortex's gaping maw, destined to be destroyed. Then, at the last moment before disaster, the momentum reversed, and the Argo was violently spat out, crashing stern first into the sea, only to be seized by a towering wave that sent it speeding over the ocean like an arrow. The crew held on tightly, some screaming, as islands flashed by through the spray, and Lynceus shouted that land lay ahead. Jason, filled with dread, saw they were heading straight for a rocky beach at terrifying speed. Just as impact seemed inevitable, the ship struck a breaking wave, throwing the crew into a tangled heap of limbs and weapons on the deck. Miraculously, the collision slowed the ship enough for it to drift safely onto the shore and settle with a creak. A wave of relief washed over the exhausted Argonauts as they untangled themselves and realized that they had survived the ordeal. Poseidon's terrifying display had made one thing clear. Their leader's authority was not to be questioned again, and the crew would never doubt Jason's judgment from that moment forward. The Argo had been washed ashore on a windswept beach beneath a tall cliff, but the Argonauts barely had time to observe their surroundings before a group of burly, armed men charged toward them, shouting, swearing, and beating their shields fiercely. Jason's first instinct was to order the crew back onto the ship and flee, but the Argo was badly damaged and in need of urgent repairs, leaving them trapped on the hostile shore. The men surrounded them quickly, their aggressive stances and fierce expressions making them look even more threatening than Heracles on his worst day. At the front stood a tall, thick-set man who introduced himself as King Amycus, declaring immediately that he wanted to fight, and threatening to throw anyone over the cliff if they refused. Dangling a pair of leather boxing gloves from one hand, he boasted that he had fought and killed every man who had set foot on his island, and that no one could ever beat him. Jason, caught off guard, barely managed to react as Amycus shoved the gloves into his ribs with such force that he stumbled back. Orpheus muttered disapprovingly nearby, calling Amycus a stupid oaf, but Jason kept his composure. Amycus mocked Jason, asking if he was afraid of a boxing match, while his men laughed cruelly, their mocking chants building into a roar of "Fight! Fight!" Amid the noise, Polydeuces quietly made his way through the Argonauts to Jason's side and whispered that he would take the challenge. Jason understood immediately. Polydeuces was the Olympic boxing champion, the perfect choice. Raising his hand for silence, Jason addressed the king and suggested that if Amycus wanted a real fight, he should face Polydeuces instead. Amycus, initially confident, was taken aback when the champion's name was spoken, and though he tried to maintain his bravado, his guard dropped. When Polydeuces asked about the rules, Amycus scoffed, mocking the very idea and laughing with his men. Then the king's massive bronze-studded gloves were brought out, dwarfing the regular pair Polydeuces had put on, and the sight of them made Polydeuces' knees weaken. Still, he held his ground as Amycus stripped off his cloak to reveal a huge hairy torso, and the crowd parted to give the fighter space. The two men circled each other like wild animals in a cage, sizing up their opponent with fierce eyes. Amycus was clearly the bigger man and lunged first, not with a punch, but a powerful, bull-like charge aimed at Polydeuces' stomach. The champion dodged swiftly, causing Amycus to crash headfirst into the onlookers with a grunt of frustration. Quickly regaining his balance, Amycus spun around with a ferocious snarl, eyes blazing, and swung a brutal blow aimed at Polydeuces' face. The bronze-studded glove nearly connected with the champion's nose, but he ducked just in time, leaving the king's massive hand to smash into empty air. The fight had begun in earnest, with the islanders watching eagerly as their fierce king faced off against the undefeated boxing champion. Polydeuces, the Olympic boxing champion, began his attack with swift and precise movements, bobbing and weaving as he delivered a relentless series of punches to King Amycus' torso, culminating in a sharp uppercut to the king's chin. Amycus staggered backward, stunned by the pain, but Polydeuces pressed on with a quick right hook to the cheek and a powerful left punch to the stomach that sent the king sprawling onto the sand. Amycus' men watched in horror. They had never seen their leader falter. The Argonauts erupted in cheers, with Castor leaping forward to congratulate his brother on the stunning display. Yet Amycus was far from defeated. Fueled by anger and the cries of his men, he rose, fists raised like spiked horns above his head, and charged fiercely at Polydeuces with a deafening roar. The impact sent Polydeuces flying sideways, pain flaring as the king's spiked gloves pierced his flesh. The islanders roared their approval, while Amycus basked in his apparent triumph, punching the air in arrogant celebration. Recovering quickly and encouraged by the shouts of his comrades, Polydeuces launched a renewed assault, striking with skill and speed. He dodged and jabbed, ducked and hooked, wearing down the lumbering king who was too slow to defend effectively. The crowd watched in awe as Polydeuces' blows transformed Amycus's face into a battered mess of bruises, blood, and broken teeth. Gasps and exclamations filled the air with each hit. Polydeuces demanded surrender, but Amycus refused, blinded by blood and rage, flailing wildly. Though Amycus might have survived by conceding earlier, a wild, primitive energy kept him fighting, forcing Polydeuces to continue his relentless onslaught until one final crushing blow shattered the king's skull. Amycus collapsed to his knees, swayed like a tree in the wind, and fell face first into the sand, dead. Atalanta cheered loudly as she helped hoist Polydeuces onto his brother's shoulders, and the Argonauts celebrated joyfully. The king's followers stood stunned. Then panic spread, and without a leader to command them, they scattered in chaos up the beach like frightened rabbits at the Argonauts' victorious cry. The Argonauts praised Polydeuces and turned to gather food, water, and materials needed to repair the Argo. Castor tended carefully to his brother's wounds, while the others camped peacefully on the beach, enjoying an undisturbed night for the first time in days. Early the next morning, the Argo set sail again, leaving King Amycus's lifeless body lying on the sand like a stranded whale. Jason watched the grim scene silently from the stern as Nauplius charted their course, estimating they would reach the eastern shore of the Propontis by nightfall with a favorable wind. Their journey was swift, and soon they arrived at Salmydessus, a city at the entrance to the Bosphorus, the narrow channel connecting the Propontis and the Black Sea. The contrast between the hostile reception they had faced on Amycus's island and the welcome here was striking. Salmydessus was ruled by King Phineus, a kind but frail old man who was blind, yet invited the Argonauts warmly to his palace for a feast. King Phineus, blind by choice, explained to the Argonauts that when the gods punished him for foretelling the future too accurately, he was given a choice between a short life or blindness. He chose blindness, a decision that angered Helios, the sun god, who was offended that Phineus preferred eternal darkness to sunlight. As punishment, Helios sent terrible creatures called the Harpies to torment him. When Jason asked how to reach Colchis, Phineus insisted that first the Argonauts must rid him of these monsters. They sat together around a massive table in the palace courtyard as servants brought in plates of rich, tempting food. Phineus warned that it made no difference if the meal was indoors or outdoors. The Harpies always arrived. Suddenly, a horrifying screech filled the air, and two winged figures descended rapidly. Jason first thought they were birds, but Mopsus recognized them as the Harpies, monsters with hideous female faces, sharp claws, and no understandable language. The Harpies swooped down, tearing at the food and spoiling everything with foul, stinking droppings that rendered the meal inedible. Phineus angrily tried to sweep them away with his staff, but they escaped as swiftly as they had come, leaving a trail of ruined food and disgust behind them. He explained that this was his daily torment. Every meal was stolen or ruined by these filthy scavengers. For years, he had struggled to eat, making prayers and offerings to Helios, but to no avail. He wished only to enjoy a peaceful meal without the Harpies' interruptions. While servants cleaned the table, Phineus recounted his failed attempts to drive the creatures off. Catapults, bows and arrows, cats, traps, and poison bait, all useless because the Harpies were too fast and immune to poison. His blind eyes filled with tears of frustration. Jason comforted him and called on Zeus and Calais, the winged sons of the north wind, to help. He asked Phineus to order another meal, which was cleared and prepared while the twins sharpened their swords and exercised their wings. When the Harpies returned, Zetes and Calais were ready, intercepting the monsters mid-air with swords drawn before they could reach the table. The battle was fierce. The screeches were deafening and the Harpies clawed savagely, but the twins' skill prevailed. The monsters fled, chased high into the sky and far across the sea. From that day on, Phineus was never troubled by the Harpies again. For the first time in years, he was able to sit down and eat without disturbance. Grateful, he shared with the Argonauts all the vital knowledge they needed, the safest way to navigate the Bosphorus, how to pass through the clashing rocks without harm, what dangers awaited on the island of Ares, how to avoid the treacherous reefs and sandbanks in the Black Sea, and the best route to Colchis. After eating, King Phineus returned with a small basket, which he handed to Jason, instructing him to get as close as possible to the rocks before opening it and to trust in Athene's guidance as they proceeded. With these words, Phineus wished them luck and went off to bed, satisfied and content. The Bosphorus, even today, is known for its fierce currents that can trap ships in dangerous whirlpools and smash them against the banks. But this was only the beginning of the Argonauts' challenges. The following afternoon, as they approached the Black Sea, the Argonauts faced the fearsome Symplegades, or clashing rocks, enormous boulders not fixed to the seabed that crashed unpredictably together, destroying any ship caught between them and sending roaring waves into the sky. Exhausted from their passage through the Bosphorus, the crew first heard ominous booming sounds as the rocks loomed out of the mist, clashing together with thunderous force. Atalanta found the basket Phineus had given them, and inside it was a white dove. Following the king's advice, Typhus steered the Argo as close as possible to the rocks, and Atalanta released the dove, which bravely flew between the rocks, losing only a few tail feathers, but making it safely through. With the rocks rebounding apart, the Argonauts seized their chance. The ship was nearly uncontrollable in the powerful current, as the rowers strained mightily to push the Argo between the massive rocks' gaping jaws. Water surged wildly, waves crashed high above, timbers creaked under pressure, and the crew struggled desperately. The gap between the boulders narrowed rapidly as the rocks moved together again, threatening to crush the ship. Typhus shouted for speed, but the roar of the waves drowned his voice. The rowers fought on with aching muscles and grinding bones, knowing any moment could bring disaster. Orpheus cried out in fear as the rocks clashed once more with a deafening thunder. The earth shook, the sea boiled, and chunks of rock tumbled into the water. Yet somehow the Argo passed through safely, though a shattered carving on its stern showed how narrowly disaster had been avoided. Exhausted but alive, the rowers relaxed as the ship drifted into the calm waters of the Black Sea. The Argonauts had achieved what no sailors before them had, surviving the passage through the clashing rocks. Jason quietly thanked Athene for their fortune. High above on Mount Olympus, the goddess awoke with a start, hearing her name called. Looking down, she saw Jason at the front of his battered ship and apologized for having been asleep during their peril. She admitted that Jason had navigated the danger alone, but promised to take better care of him in the future. Then, seeing the rocks below, she focused her power and fixed the clashing rocks in place, so they would never move again. Back on the Argo, Jason noticed the dreadful booming had stopped. Glancing back, he saw the massive rocks standing firm and still, forever locked in the positions Athene had set, ensuring that no other ship would face their deadly clash again. If Athene had not fallen asleep, Perhaps the disasters that struck the Argonauts on a quiet riverbank near the Black Sea coast could have been avoided. The goddess, usually vigilant, was unaware as the crew sought rest and water. Two younger Argonauts, Idmon and Idas, volunteered to fetch water, carrying a pitcher through the reeds. Suddenly, a huge wild boar charged at them. The beast attacked Idmon, driving its tusks into his legs and leaving him screaming in pain. Idas called for help, but was helpless against the furious animal until it charged again. This time, Idas stood his ground and thrust his spear into the boar's heart, killing it. Sadly, it was too late to save Idmon, who had lost too much blood before the others arrived. Jason silently cursed the gods, but none answered, and Athena remained asleep. Later that day, misfortune struck again, as Tiphys, the ship's pilot, fell ill with a fever. Far from home, Jason had no herbs to help and could only watch as Tiphys suffered and then slipped into unconsciousness. Just before dawn, the pilot died, leaving the Argonauts sorrowful and weakened. They performed funeral rites as best they could, with Orpheus playing a mournful lament while they wept by the graves of their fallen comrades. With heavy hearts, they rowed back to sea and sailed eastward under sail. They passed the land of the Amazons, fierce female warriors, and sailed near a coast where people lived in small wooden castles. Near sunset, Lynceus spotted a small rocky island, and Ancaeus, chosen to replace Tiphys as pilot, brought the ship safely to shore. That night, a terrible storm struck, with howling winds and driving rain. In the dark hours, shouts from the beach woke those who had managed to sleep, and the Argonauts rushed down to find 4 soaked men climbing from the waves. These men were survivors of a shipwreck, having barely escaped drowning by clinging to pieces of their broken ship. By fate or fortune, these men were the sons of Chalciope and Phrixus, the boy who had once ridden a golden ram to Colchis. Their father was dead, and they had been traveling from Colchis to Greece to claim their grandfather's kingdom when the storm destroyed their ship. To Jason, these 4 new crew members who knew the way to Colchis seemed a divine gift. The men joined the Argonauts without hesitation, for without a ship, food, or weapons, they had no other choice. The storm passed, and under clear skies the next morning, the Argonauts prepared to set sail. Yet just yards from the shore, the sky suddenly darkened again, not with storm clouds, but with large, dark, ragged shapes looming overhead, signaling that new challenges were about to confront the weary crew. The Argonauts had endured many trials since leaving King Phineus's palace, and it took some time for them to recognize the new danger approaching. It was Atalanta who first realized the threat. A flock of massive, man-eating Stymphalian birds, with sharp bronze beaks and deadly metal feathers, was swooping down from the sky. Phineus had warned them these fierce creatures nested on the island of Ares and would attack without hesitation. Suddenly, metal feathers rained down, slicing the sail and wounding a rower named Oileus in the shoulder. The Argonauts quickly donned their helmets and shields, some continuing to row while others shouted and clanged their weapons to scare the birds away. Atalanta skillfully shot arrow after arrow, bringing down 14 of the deadly birds, each one crashing into the sea with a splash, much to the crew's relief and cheers. Despite Oileus's injury and the damaged sail, the Argonauts survived the attack mostly unharmed, believing now that no more dangers stood between them and their goal, Colchis. Meanwhile, on Mount Olympus, the goddesses Hera and Athene held a meeting, watching the battered ship and its weary crew from above. Hera expressed concern for the Argonauts. Knowing King Aetes of Colchis would not easily give up the golden fleece. Athene agreed, and both felt guilty for having neglected Jason lately. They recalled the near disaster at the Clashing Rocks and the losses the crew had suffered, including the wild boar attack. Determined to help, Hera suddenly suggested involving Eros, the mischievous son of Aphrodite, who wielded love arrows that could cause great trouble. Athene was skeptical, questioning how love could aid Jason in such perilous times. But Hera insisted that Jason needed a powerful ally with inside knowledge at Ate's palace. She proposed that Eros should make Medea, the king's daughter and a skilled witch, fall deeply in love with Jason. If Medea could be swayed by love, she might use her knowledge and magic to help the Argonauts succeed. Athene was surprised, but quickly saw the wisdom in the plan, and together they went to Aphrodite to ask for her help. Aphrodite promised to persuade her son Eros to perform the task. When she found him, Eros was playing dice with his friend Ganymede, winning by cheating as usual. Aphrodite offered Eros a golden ball striped with blue enamel, a precious treasure that had once belonged to Zeus as a child. She tossed it to Ganymede, and the ball flew through the air like a shooting star sparkling brilliantly. Excited by the gift, Eros agreed to shoot his love arrow straight into Medea's heart, setting the stage for an alliance that could change the fate of Jason and the Argonauts forever. The Argonauts, after a long and perilous journey, were now rowing up the river Phasis toward the land of Colchis, where the golden fleece was kept. Before the city came into sight, Jason ordered the Argo to be moored quietly in a hidden backwater surrounded by reeds. It was time to carefully plan their next move. Jason suggested that he should approach King Ates' palace, accompanied by the 4 sons of Phrixus, the king's grandsons, and politely ask for the golden fleece. The plan was to seek the king's favor first, and only if he refused would Jason resort to more forceful means. The group agreed to this cautious approach, and Jason and his 4 companions made their way to the palace. Upon arriving, they were greeted by Chalciope, the mother of the 4 sons, who was surprised but grateful to see her children safe, and thanked Jason for rescuing them. She promised to do everything she could to convince her father to part with the fleece. However, when King Ates caught sight of Jason, his expression twisted into a scowl. The presence of a strange young Greek in his palace was unexpected and unwelcome, especially since King Laomedon of Troy had vowed to bar all Greeks from the Black Sea. Ates questioned his grandsons sharply about their return, and the youngest, Aegeus, who was favored by the king, explained how they owed their lives to Jason's daring quest and pleaded for the fleece to be handed over. But the king was furious and let out a harsh, mocking laugh. He circled Jason like a wolf and threatened him fiercely, ordering him to leave immediately or face brutal punishment. Just as the tension reached its peak, Medea, the king's daughter, entered the room. The moment she saw Jason, she felt an immediate, intense pang in her heart. It was love at first sight. To her, Jason was the most handsome and extraordinary man she had ever laid eyes on, a god among mortals. Completely captivated and devoted, she silently vowed to do anything for him. Eros's arrow had struck true. Medea saw her father's anger and heard Jason's desperate pleas, telling of his long journey filled with dangers and hardships, all for the fleece. Deeply moved, she stepped forward to plead with her father on Jason's behalf. Chalciope and the grandsons soon joined her, reminding King Ates that Jason's bravery had saved their lives. Even Medea's younger brother, Apsyrtus, appeared quietly from behind a column, observing the scene. For a moment, Ates seemed unmoved, but then a smile slowly spread across his face. He returned to his seat, stroking his chin thoughtfully, and the room fell silent in anticipation. Finally, Hades agreed to grant Jason the fleece, but only on one condition. He outlined a daunting task that had never been accomplished before. Nearby, in the field of Ares, two legendary bulls roamed freely, bulls forged by Hephaestus, the divine blacksmith. These beasts were unlike any others. Their hooves were made of solid bronze, and they breathed fire. No one had ever succeeded in taming these fearsome creatures, but Jason would have to do so. His challenge was to yoke the bulls together, then plough the field of Ares and sow it with dragon's teeth. Only upon completing this impossible feat would the golden fleece be his. Jason glanced around the room, weighing the king's words and the monumental task that lay ahead, knowing that the next chapter of his quest would demand every ounce of courage and skill he possessed. Jason faced the impossible task King Hades had set before him, the taming of the fire-breathing bronze-hoofed bulls and ploughing the field of Ares. Though every face in the room seemed to urge him to accept, the challenge was one no mortal had ever achieved. Yet when his eyes met Medea's pleading gaze, he found himself unable to refuse. Reluctantly but confidently, he promised to complete the task if it meant he could claim the golden fleece. Hades, convinced Jason would fail, readily agreed. Later that evening, Colchis summoned Jason to Medea's room, explaining cryptically that her sister possessed special powers and believed she could help him. When Jason entered, he was greeted by a warm smile and an overwhelming mix of herbal scents that reminded him of Chiron's cave, though some were strange and unfamiliar. The room was crowded with bottles and jars filled with mysterious ingredients, dried flowers and branches, and in one corner a large bronze cauldron bubbled with a thick black liquid emitting a pungent smell. Realizing Medea was a witch, or as she preferred, a sorceress, Jason peered into the cauldron and gagged at the foul stench, which she identified as dragon's blood, though she suspected it was not fresh. Colchis urged Medea to explain her reason for summoning Jason before she could get distracted with flirting. Medea was businesslike and blunt, saying she could help Jason, but only if he agreed to her conditions. Jason, distracted by the curious labels on the jars, such as toad's eyes medium strength and powdered unicorn hair, Trollhorn, apply sparingly, asked what those conditions were. Medea's demand stunned him. She wanted him to take her back to Greece and marry her. She explained that if she helped him tame the bulls and secure the fleece, she expected to be his wife and queen once he returned home, especially when he would become king after his uncle. Jason stood silent, overwhelmed by the powerful sense and Medea's enchanting presence. Her green eyes, soft voice, and flowing hair left him powerless to refuse. He finally agreed to marry her. Pleased, Medea immediately began preparations, pulling a bottle of deep red potion from the shelf. Though meant for fire-breathing dragons, she believed it would work against the bulls as well. As she uncorked it, a stronger aroma filled the room. She told Jason the potion's origin. It was connected to Prometheus, the Titan who had stolen fire from the gods and was punished by being chained to a mountain, where an eagle tore out his liver daily, only for it to regrow each time. Jason, still dazed, listened as Medea explained the significance of the potion, dropping it carefully into a smaller container. With her knowledge of magic and potions, Medea was ready to assist Jason in overcoming the king's deadly challenge. Medea sealed the bottle of potion tightly and shook it well, holding it up to the light with confidence, declaring it ready to protect Jason from the bull's fiery breath. She explained how the potion was made from the blood of Prometheus, spilled onto the earth where yellow crocuses grew, and from the red stamens of those flowers, she had crafted this unique and powerful defense against dragon's fire. Proudly, she handed the bottle to Jason and instructed him to rub the potion on his clothes, weapons, and every inch of exposed skin so he could face the dangerous bulls unharmed. Jason took the bottle carefully, feeling weak but grateful. Chalciope then appeared beside him, gently guiding him toward the door to encourage him to leave. But Medea suddenly remembered something important and called him back. She reached up and pulled down a large, dusty leather bag from a high shelf, tossing it to Jason with a rattle of its mysterious contents. She told him the bag held dragon's teeth, which were leftovers from Cadmus's ancient battle, hinting at their great power, but was quickly interrupted by Chalciope's impatient reminder that they did not have all night. Medea laughed off the interruption, promising to tell the full story another time, and told Jason simply to remember to throw the bag of teeth at the men he would face, though he had no idea what she meant. Before closing the door behind him, Medea blew Jason a kiss and wished him good luck, leaving him to prepare for the daunting task ahead, with the potion in his hand and the bag of dragon's teeth at his side. Medea's magic potion smelled terrible and stung Jason's eyes, but early the next morning he focused on the task ahead as he carefully smeared the potion all over his body, clothes, and weapons, determined not to let the awful smell distract him. The field of Ares lay on the side of a steep grassy hill close to King Aid's palace, and when Jason arrived, he saw no sign of the fire-breathing bulls, only a group of tense onlookers gathered near the gate, whispering nervously. Jason strode past them confidently, dragging the tilling blades behind him and carrying a spear, a heavy bronze yoke attached to a wooden pole, the bag of dragon's teeth, and a large shield. The spectators wished him luck, fully aware that no one who had faced the bulls before had survived, instead ending as charred bones. Jason went deeper into the field, planted his spear in the ground, and laid down all his gear except for his shield, which he held firmly in front of him, before climbing the hill. The sun was already warm, and he soon worked up a sweat, but he remembered just in time not to wipe off the protective potion. Suddenly, a distant low rumble began, growing quickly into a pounding noise that shook the ground beneath his feet. Jason scanned the horizon anxiously, his heart pounding and mouth dry, as a terrifying bellow echoed through the air and a fiery cloud of dust rose. Moments later, two enormous bulls charged over the hill, their bronze hooves pounding thunderously, eyes glowing blood red, and flames roaring from their nostrils. Jason clenched his teeth and braced himself as the fire surged toward him, but the strange prickling on his skin showed the potion was working. Flames began licking the grass and creeping toward his legs, and though a crowd member shouted a warning, Jason stood firm, mesmerized by the bull's fierce eyes and charging horns. With a deep breath, he prepared for impact. The bull's horn slammed into his shield with a thunderous crash that echoed across the field, and a great plume of black smoke rose as the fire enveloped him, leading the crowd to believe Jason was doomed, certain they'd witnessed his destruction. Many began to leave, convinced the fire and impact had finished him. But suddenly, cries of amazement brought the spectators back as the enormous fireball surrounding Jason and the bulls began to move. Through the thick smoke and roaring flames, they saw a shadowy figure gripping the bull's horns, dragging the furious beast down the hill. Jason was alive, fighting with superhuman strength to control the raging bulls that stomped and breathed fire, but he held firm, guiding them slowly toward the yoke he had left behind. The bulls roared furiously, digging their hooves into the scorched earth and lashing out with their fiery breath. Yet Jason did not release his hold until he reached the yoke. Then, with swift precision, he snatched up the heavy bronze yoke and threw it over the bulls' horns, fastening it onto their necks, beginning the impossible task of taming these fearsome creatures. Jason stood firm as the stunned fire-breathing bulls, with smoke curling from their nostrils and eyes rolling wildly, paused in confusion. Quickly, he bound the bronze yoke securely around their necks and hooked the wooden yoke pole to the heavy metal tilling blades behind him. Moving swiftly to the back, he grabbed his spear and jabbed the bulls, urging them forward. The fierce creatures began to move, dragging the tiller through the scorched earth of the field of Ares, and the crowd of onlookers at the gate gasped in disbelief. Jason had done the impossible by harnessing the wild, fiery bulls, and was now ploughing the sacred field under the hot sun. The people watching could hardly believe their eyes, and someone hurried off to tell King Ates what was happening. Jason worked tirelessly, enduring the burning heat and keeping the bull steady, knowing that if he faltered even for a moment, the beast might break free and ruin everything. He also knew that leaving even a small patch of the field untilled would give Ates an excuse to claim Jason had failed the task. As the hours passed, the crowd lost interest and slowly drifted away. When Ates arrived at the field, he observed Jason's hard work with a knowing smile. The young Greek might have survived the dangerous bulls, but the king was confident that the next challenge, sowing the dragon's teeth, would be far beyond Jason's strength to overcome. Near sunset, Jason finished the final furrow and, exhausted, released the bulls, which plodded away over the hill, spent and panting. Jason then took the large leather bag that Medea had given him and began scattering its contents over the freshly ploughed soil. As he worked, he noticed the strange seeds beginning to sprout. At first, sharp, triangular shoots glistened in the golden sunlight. Fascinated, he continued sowing until he had covered about 2/3 of the field. When he glanced back, the shoots had grown taller, revealing themselves as the tips of spears shining in the last rays of the sun. With a gasp, Jason realized that the spears were growing out of the ground itself. He hurried to finish sowing the remaining seeds, then threw down the empty bag and sat down near the gate to watch. Soon, the spear tips were followed by the glint of helmets emerging from the earth. Jason's astonishment quickly turned to dread as the first head appeared, followed by many more, each face slowly turning to glare at him with savage snarls. Hands appeared next, waving spears threateningly, and armed men began to rise, rising from the ground in an angry army intent on killing him. Jason's mind raced for a plan as the men shouted and banged their shields, preparing to march forward. He considered running, but there was nowhere to hide from such a vast force. Cutting them down seemed impossible given their number. As knees and then feet appeared, the noise grew deafening with war cries and the pounding of shields. Jason stood helpless, watching as the men took their first steps, ready to attack. Overwhelmed and exhausted, he closed his eyes and silently prayed for a quick end. Suddenly, a voice whispered in his ear, "Use the bag." Startled, Jason opened his eyes and looked around, but no one was there. Recognizing the voice as Medea's, he realized what she meant just in time. Darting to the empty bag lying nearby, he grabbed it and threw it forcefully into the middle of the advancing soldiers. In an instant, the army halted and then erupted into chaotic violence, turning on each other with furious clashes of shields and spears. Jason sank to the ground, overwhelmed with exhaustion and relief, as he watched the warriors destroy themselves in a frenzy of bloodshed. The impossible task was completed through cunning and help from Medea's magic, allowing Jason to survive yet another deadly trial in his quest for the Golden Fleece. When Jason finally left the field of Ares as twilight deepened, the ridge was strewn with hundreds of lifeless bodies silhouetted against the blood-red sky, scattered like confetti over the freshly tilled earth. Exhausted and aching in every limb, he dragged himself back toward the Argo through the growing darkness, his filthy, bedraggled appearance and wild grin startling a man on the riverbank. Despite being footsore and drained, Jason felt more elated than ever. He had completed the impossible task and believed the Golden Fleece would soon be his. The next morning, King Ates was furious to hear that Jason was alive. A messenger reported seeing Jason the night before, wandering along the riverbank covered in soot with a mad grin. Dismissing the messenger abruptly, Ates ordered his servants to summon Medea, telling one maid that he had a plan. Later that morning, Jason, Orpheus, and Atalanta approached the palace gates, where Medea was waiting, clutching a branch. She rushed to Jason, urgently telling him they had no time to lose and must go straight to the grove of Ares to seize the fleece. Jason said he was going to see her father, as he had completed the task and expected Ates to give him the fleece. Medea firmly interrupted, warning that Ates intended to kill Jason and all the Argonauts and burn the Argo, revealing that the king had told her this just minutes before. Medea began pulling Jason away from the palace, with Atalanta and Orpheus following. They quickly walked into the nearby forest, unnoticed except by a small figure who slipped out of the palace gates behind them. Medea explained in a voice full of anguish that Ates had lied about giving the fleece, expecting the bulls or soldiers to kill Jason, and had been furious to learn he was still alive. Jason instructed Atalanta to return to the Argo and tell the crew to row along the river and moor close to the grove of Ares. She eagerly ran off, leaving dust in her wake, while the others continued walking briskly as Medea shared more details about Ates' deadly plan. Suddenly, Jason stopped and gripped Orpheus's arm, voicing his doubts about trusting Medea, suspecting it could be a trap. Medea was stunned by his suspicion, but calmly told him that if she had wanted to harm him, she could have easily ensured his death by the bulls or soldiers. She looked into Jason's eyes, swearing she was trying to save his life and warning that without her help, his chances were slim. Her sincere plea made Jason feel ashamed for doubting her, and he began to apologize. But before he could, Medea suddenly screamed, asking who was there. Jason turned to see a small figure hiding in a bush by the side of the path. Medea identified him as her vile little brother, Apsyrtus, who was laughing and admitted to having followed them unnoticed from the palace. Medea angrily dragged Apsyrtus from his hiding place. The boy stubbornly refused to leave and threatened to tell their father where Medea was if forced to go. The two bickered like children, calling each other names. But in the end, they had no choice but to let Apsyrtus come along with them as they continued their dangerous journey toward the grove of Ares. Jason, Medea, Orpheus, and Apsyrtus hurried through the forest toward the grove of Ares, with Medea explaining their plan as they went. When they arrived, a loud, terrifying hissing told them they had reached their destination. Crouching behind a bush at the edge of a clearing, they saw a vast oak tree standing in the middle, surrounded by skulls and bones. From the tree slithered an enormous scaly dragon longer than the Argo itself, with huge snake-like jaws filled with rows of sharp fangs and a flickering forked red tongue. Jason stared at its unblinking yellow eyes, feeling almost hypnotized, until his gaze caught a shining golden object high in the branches, the golden fleece, glowing like a beautiful golden cloud. This was the prize he had sought for so long. But a deadly poisonous dragon stood between him and the fleece. Suddenly, the sound of music broke the tense moment. Over the dragon's hissing, Jason heard Orpheus playing his lyre, soon joined by Medea's melodious singing. Their music was meant to charm the dragon to sleep, and Jason felt himself growing drowsy, but managed to shake off the trance just in time. As the hissing began to fade, Medea and Jason stepped slowly into the clearing. Jason carried a shield and sword, while Medea held a juniper branch and kept singing her bewitching song. The dragon lunged forward but quickly swayed and reeled, struggling against sleep. Medea flicked the branch at its wide open eyes, sending sparkling drops of potion flying through the air. The dragon's head wavered as it succumbed to the magic. With each flick and each note from Orpheus's lyre, the dragon's enormous head began to nod and finally dropped to the ground with a heavy thud, fast asleep. Medea warned Jason that the magic wouldn't last long, and with no more potion left, he had to hurry. Jason climbed over the dragon's nose and head, then along its back, up to the oak tree. Carefully balancing on mossy branches, he made his way to the golden fleece, shielding his eyes from its dazzling brilliance. Medea whispered for him to hurry, and Jason reached out, touching the thick golden wool, feeling a warm thrill of excitement. He had finally reached the fleece. Suddenly, the dragon began to hiss softly, waking up. Jason grabbed the edge of the fleece, which was heavier than expected, and wrapped it around his arms. He carefully retraced his steps along the branch and down the dragon's back, just as the creature's sleepy jaws began to open. Jason jumped to the ground moments before the dragon lunged with its mouth wide open, ready to swallow them whole. Medea screamed for them to run, and they raced across the clearing, stepping on bones and skulls scattered on the ground. The dragon lunged again, but Jason, Medea, and Absyrtus leapt over a bush just in time, as its jaws snapped shut behind them. The dragon spat out leaves, twigs, and a piece of Medea's skirt in disgust. Medea grabbed her frightened brother's arm and urged him to move quickly, pulling him through the trees toward the river. Absyrtus trembled with fear, while the others followed closely behind. Suddenly, a sound more terrifying than the dragon's hissing reached their ears, the galloping of hooves and the clanking of weapons. Soldiers on horseback were chasing after them. As Jason ran, he prayed that Atalanta had safely reached the Argo and that their escape would succeed. The sounds of soldiers and horses grew louder behind Jason and Medea as they fled through the forest, the pounding of hooves echoing close. Jason dared not look back, but could hear a terrified scream as one of the men fell victim to the dragon's jaws, though the rest pressed on relentlessly. Medea, determined and fearless, half carried and half dragged her frightened brother Absyrtus, urging him to move faster as the danger closed in. Bursting out of the dark forest into bright sunlight, they found the riverbank just ahead, where the Argo awaited with its sail raised and rowers ready. The Argonauts cheered as Jason emerged, sweat streaming down his face and fear shining in his eyes, all knowing he was running for his very life. Suddenly, a dozen armed horsemen charged into view, spears raised high, ready to strike. In his panic, Jason stumbled and fell, the golden fleece flying from his grasp as he tumbled onto the grass. A towering horseman loomed over him, spear raised to deliver a deadly blow, his face twisted in a furious scowl. At that critical moment, Atalanta's arrow flew swift and true, striking the horseman's heart and ending his attack instantly. Freed from danger, Jason scrambled to his feet, grabbed the fleece, and dashed toward the ship. Meanwhile, the Argonauts sprang into action, launching a fierce counterattack. Zetes and Calais, the winged sons of Boreas, soared overhead, showering arrows down on the attackers. Half a dozen soldiers fell wounded on the riverbank, while Periclymenus, gifted with the power to change his shape, transformed into a powerful lion and charged into the middle of the remaining horsemen. The terrified horses reared, throwing their riders to the ground before fleeing wildly into the forest. Disorganized and stunned, the soldiers scrambled in confusion, unable to regroup. Jason and the others climbed aboard the Argo as Lynceus quickly untied the mooring rope. The rowers strained at their oars, and the ship surged forward, cutting through the water and leaving their enemies far behind. Standing proudly at the prow, Jason held the golden fleece high above his head, triumphant and victorious, the prize of their long and dangerous journey finally secured. Jason's brief moment of victory was shattered when King Ates appeared suddenly, sailing fiercely down the river toward the Argo. Standing tall on the prow of his warship, his face twisted with rage and shouting for his golden fleece to be returned. Jason quickly furled the fleece at his feet and began rowing desperately. But without Heracles and badly outnumbered, the Argonauts were no match for the king's powerful oarsmen. Despite their best efforts, Ates' ship gained steadily, its sharp bronze prow ready to ram the Argo's stern. The king's archers loosed a hail of arrows that splashed just short of the ship, preparing to fire again. Then Medea took a shocking and cruel action. In full view of her furious father, standing at the stern of the Argo, she raised a shining knife to her younger brother Apsyrtus's throat and slit it swiftly and mercilessly. Ates was powerless to stop her, screaming in horror. As Medea began to butcher her brother's body, chopping off limbs and slicing the torso with cold detachment, Castor tried to intervene, but Medea defended herself fiercely, her eyes blazing with savage determination. The Argonauts, torn between shock and the urgent need to keep rowing, could do nothing to stop her. Piece by piece, Medea cast her brother's body into the river, forcing her grief-stricken father to command his crew to slow down to collect the bloody remains from the water. Ates wept and wailed, calling Medea a barbarous witch and lamenting the loss of his beloved son, as he cradled Apsyrtus's severed head like a grieving parent. This cruel sacrifice was the key to the Argonauts' escape from Colchis, allowing them to flee down the river Phasis and out into the Black Sea with the Golden Fleece safely aboard. For the first time since their departure from Greece, the magic prow of the Argo spoke with the voice of the goddess Hera, guiding them home. Hera's wisdom was clear. They could not return by the same route, or Ates would surely follow and catch them. Instead, she directed them on a secret path that combined sailing by sea, navigating rivers, and hauling the ship overland for many days through difficult terrain, including hills, mountains, bogs, and streams, following the prow's precise commands: turn left again, now right, straight on. They journeyed tirelessly mile after mile. Though Hera's guidance helped them avoid numerous dangers, the journey was still filled with hardships before they could finally reach their homeland. The Argonauts' only focus now was to get home, to a hero's welcome filled with friends, family, fortune and feasts, with Jason crowned king. Yet before that joy could come, they faced one of the deadliest challenges known to sailors, one that only the great hero Ulysses had survived before them. Hera warned them that just south of their path lay the island of the Sirens, treacherous jagged rocks responsible for countless shipwrecks. These creatures were monsters with beautiful female faces and enchanting voices that lured sailors to their doom on the rocks. The crew was filled with dread at the mere mention of their name, recalling the fearful stories told in their childhood. Knowing survival depended entirely on the goddess's guidance, they listened intently as Hera explained the plan. When they neared the island, Orpheus would play his lyre while Hera sang her protective song. The Argonauts had to keep their eyes fixed on the ship's prow and listen only to Hera and Orpheus, for their lives depended on it. Hera's voice was serious and stern as she sang the warning, and the crew paid close attention to her repeated verses, which promised that only by heeding her song would Jason become king and survive the peril. As they approached the Sirens' Island, the crew focused on Hera's song and Orpheus's lyre, which grew louder to drown out the sirens' sweet and dangerously enchanting music that drifted mysteriously across the water. The Argonauts joined in singing and drumming on the benches in rhythm, following the goddess's commands. However, Butes, the youngest among them, struggled to resist. His head slowly turned toward the island, where he saw the most beautiful faces he had ever seen, olive-skinned with shining eyes and luscious lips, singing a hauntingly silver and sweet melody that wormed its way deep into his mind. He felt compelled to listen, to move closer, to drink in their music and surrender to the magnetic charm of their voices. Instantly entranced, Butes broke free from the hands holding him back. To him, they were powerless, strange obstacles preventing him from the irresistible music he needed. His eyes glazed over as he surrendered completely to the trance, lost in the beautiful music dancing in his head. As he climbed over the ship's edge, hands reached out to pull him back, but he was determined to break free. Nothing could stop him as he leapt into the air, falling toward the music, toward freedom, toward the sirens. But his freedom ended abruptly when he crashed onto the jagged rocks below. The next wave washed his lifeless body out into the swirling ocean. The dull thud of his fall briefly muffled the siren's song, but they did not pause for even a moment as the Argo sailed slowly past them. Their eyes shone with cruel delight as they saw the captain's tears streaming down his cheeks, his face clenched as he still sang Hera's protective song through gritted teeth, mourning the loss of the young sailor who had fallen victim to their deadly enchantment. The Argonauts were deeply saddened by the death of Butes, but relieved that no one else had fallen victim to the siren's deadly song. So they sailed on. When they neared the island of Corsica, the Argo suddenly stopped moving despite a strong breeze, filling the sail and the rowers pulling hard on their oars. Jason went to the prow to demand an explanation and heard from Hera that they had offended Zeus by being stained with the blood of an innocent child. Because of this, they could not continue home until they were purified. This was the first time the murder of Absyrtus had been mentioned since their escape from Colchis. Though everyone remained shocked and horrified by Medea's brutal act, they also recognized that it had saved them from certain defeat or death. Jason asked how they could be purified, but the magic prow remained silent. Medea, pale and trembling, stepped forward and said she might know a way. She revealed that her aunt, Circe, a far more powerful sorceress, lived nearby and might be able to help. Jason reluctantly agreed, wishing they had another choice. They turned the ship around and sailed back the way they had come, guided once more by Hera's voice to the island where Circe lived. After mooring the Argo in an inlet, Jason and Medea set off through the trees and up a steep mountain path along a stream toward Circe's home. Medea warned Jason not to anger her aunt, as Circe was known to transform unwelcome visitors into pigs. They soon reached a low stone house partly built into the mountainside, with a front garden full of cats of many sizes and markings. Medea remarked it was fortunate Circe now kept only cats, as she had once kept lions and wolves. Just then the door opened, and Medea stopped Jason, reminding him not to let Circe fall in love with him, since the last man she had fallen for was trapped in her home for a year. A tall, grey-haired woman in a long blue robe and many ceramic beads appeared and greeted them warmly, with bright green eyes and a deep, husky voice. She called Medea darling, admired Jason's appearance, and led them inside, mentioning she had dreamed of their visit while enjoying a goblet of homemade wine and inviting them to join her. Inside, the small cottage was crammed with an astonishing jumble of items: papyrus scrolls, carved stone tablets, bottles, flasks, goblets, jars of paint, brushes, mirrors, seashells, feathers, branches, dried leaves and flowers, patterned fabrics, bronze tools, vases, baskets, terracotta pots, silver lamps, gold trinkets, wooden chests, caskets, a huge bronze cauldron, and countless cats. The visible parts of the walls were covered in murals painted by Circe herself, filling the space with a rich and mysterious atmosphere as Jason and Medea prepared to seek her help in cleansing their guilt and continuing their perilous journey home. Circe asked Medea if her dream had been right, if she really had killed Absyrtus, and when Medea nodded, tears filled her eyes and she fell to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably and releasing all her grief and remorse. Circe comforted her, blaming the pain on the reckless interference of young Eros. After Medea calmed down, Circe took them through her garden to a clear natural pool, fed by a waterfall, where they waded into the cool water and she performed a cleansing ritual, calling on Zeus the purifier to calm the anger of the Furies that haunted Medea for the murder of her brother. Back at her house, Circe lit a fire and cooked a magical healing meal for them, after which they sat before the flames while Circe shared her wisdom, wit, and homemade wine until sleep gently claimed them all. The next morning, the Argo set sail once again, but their journey from Circe's island back toward Colchis was far from smooth. As they sailed along the western coast of Greece, a violent storm whipped up by Poseidon and Boreas struck, blowing the ship wildly off course. After days of relentless rowing and sailing across the Mediterranean, the exhausted and starving crew decided to stop at the island of Crete for rest and provisions. However, upon entering the port, a massive rock crashed into the Argo's stern, drenching the crew and flooding the deck. Looking up, Jason saw the source: Talos, the giant bronze guardian of Crete made by Hephaestus, towering with arms raised to hurl another boulder. Medea quickly explained who Talos was and urged to get her to shore so she could distract him. As more rocks fell around them, they rowed to the shore where Medea bravely approached the giant, holding out a cup of potion, coaxing him with promises of eternal life and greater strength, despite Atalanta's sarcastic protest that Talos was already a living automaton. Talos bent down with creaking joints, drank the potion in one gulp, then swayed and clattered to the ground. Medea then pulled out a metal stopper from the back of his ankle, causing the life-giving liquid to slowly leak out, and while Talos slept, the Argonauts were safe to land. After 2 days and nights on Crete, the crew prepared for the final leg of their journey. With growing excitement, they sailed through the many islands of the Aegean Sea, followed the coast of Euboea, and finally entered the sheltered bay of Pagasai near Iolcus. As the sun set over Mount Pelion, they reached the waters of home, ready to complete their long and perilous voyage. The golden fleece gleamed brilliantly in Jason's hands as he stood proudly on the prow of the Argo, reflecting on the long and perilous journey they had endured. He thought about the countless dangers they had faced together, the fierce storms that threatened to sink them, deadly battles against enemies both mortal and divine, and the terrifying monsters and giants that sought to end their quest. His thoughts turned somber as he remembered the brave Argonauts who never made it back, Hylas, whose disappearance had cast a shadow over their voyage, Idmon, the seer who had foretold danger but sailed on anyway, Tiphys, their skilled pilot lost too soon, and young Butes, who had fallen victim to the deadly sirens. Yet despite these losses, Jason admired the courage and strength of those who remained, united by their shared determination to reach home. His mind wandered to Heracles, wondering where the mighty hero might be after their parting. Looking toward the peak of Mount Pelion, Jason recalled Chiron, the wise and kind centaur who had raised him with patience and care. He remembered Chiron's solemn words the night before Jason had left the cave, words that now felt like a promise. A long, long journey, a chance to wear a crown. It seemed like a lifetime ago when he had descended from the mountain and carried the old woman across the stream, not realizing at the time that she was the goddess Hera in disguise. Now he understood. That moment was more than chance. It was fate. Hera had guided their voyage all along, steering them safely through countless perils and helping them overcome impossible obstacles. Though Jason was unaware that Medea's love for him and her aid in escaping with the Golden Fleece had also been part of Hera's grand plan, he nonetheless offered a deep and grateful prayer to the goddess for her protection and guidance. As he gazed toward the city of Iolcus, its terracotta rooftops glowing warmly beneath the setting sun, Jason thought back to when he had first arrived as a wide-eyed young man, filled with hope and trust, boldly accepting King Peleus' challenge to retrieve the Golden Fleece. Now he was no longer that boy, but a hero, returning from an epic adventure, carrying the legendary prize that would secure his rightful place as king. The journey had been long and arduous, marked by sacrifice and triumph. But at last he was homeward bound, ready to claim the kingdom that awaited him. An old fisherman was sitting on the beach and mending his nets when a bright light far out at sea caught his eye. Dropping his nets and wincing at the pain in his stiff joints, he slowly rose and hobbled to the water's edge, squinting across the waves at something glittering in the evening sun. Shielding his eyes, he stood transfixed as the dazzling shape floated slowly toward the shore. Then he gasped in surprise, realizing it was the famous Golden Fleece aboard the ship. As the Argo drifted gently onto the sand and the crew stepped into the shallow water, the old fisherman stared with a puzzled frown. Jason greeted him, and the old man asked cautiously if he was truly the Jason who had set off to retrieve the Golden Fleece from Colchis. Jason smiled proudly, confirming it, though the fisherman told him that many believed he was dead after being gone so long. The fisherman's anxious voice deepened as he spoke of terrible events that had unfolded during Jason's absence, mentioning King Peleus' dreadful actions after hearing Jason was dead and that Peleus' son Acastus had died in a shipwreck. Jason's initial joy faded as the old man's troubled expression grew, making him uneasy. When Jason demanded to know what had happened, the fisherman reluctantly explained that after Jason left, King Peleus released Jason's father, King Aeson, from prison. Then, Jason's mother had given birth to a baby boy named Promachus. But Peleus, fearing threats to his rule, had found the baby, taken him from his mother, and dashed out his brains on the palace floor. Jason's face went pale, and a wave of nausea and weakness swept over him, nearly causing him to collapse. Grief quickly turned to anger, but the fisherman wasn't finished. He hesitated and lowered his eyes, speaking quietly about Jason's mother, who had been so devastated by the loss of her child that the weight of the fisherman's words hung heavy in the air, leaving Jason tense and anxious, bracing for the next terrible truth. Jason learned from the old fisherman that his mother, overwhelmed by the loss of her sons, had taken her own life, and his father had died by poison. The flood of grief crashed over Jason as he sank onto the golden fleece, burying his face in its wool and howling in despair. The old man, exhausted by his painful task, offered a comforting hand on Jason's back, but there was little to say. In his torment, Jason realized how foolish he had been to trust King Peleus, who had never intended to give up the kingdom, but had sent him on a dangerous quest to get rid of him. All the hardship, danger, and adventure meant nothing now. His family was gone, his mother, father, and baby brother, all dead. Overwhelmed by sorrow, Jason tore at the fleece in frustration, his pain raw and unrelenting. The Argonauts watched helplessly as their leader writhed in anguish, tears flowing freely. But slowly the tears stopped, and a fierce resolve replaced the sorrow. Rising to his knees, Jason's face hardened with anger and determination. With a roar that drowned out the crashing waves and crying gulls, he vowed that Peleus would pay for his betrayal. His mind was set on revenge, but a direct assault on Peleus's well-guarded palace was impossible, and Acastus, Peleus's son, refused to take part in killing his own father. It was Medea who devised a plan. She first made the old fishermen swear to secrecy about their return, then urged the Argonauts to hide the ship and themselves in a forest near the city. She promised that when torches burned on the palace roof, it would mean her plan had succeeded and the city was theirs. Medea spent the next day preparing carefully. At dawn, she left the ship and by nightfall approached Iolcus disguised as an old woman, leading a tired ram and pulling a cart carrying a statue of the goddess Artemis and a large bronze cauldron. At the city gates, she loudly announced a message from Artemis, wishing good fortune to all citizens. The guards, fearing the wrath of the quick-tempered goddess, did not dare stop her. Under the light of a full moon, Medea moved through the streets, calling out her message as she passed the marketplace and temple, making her way to the palace. Peleus was awake and waiting for her at the gates, curious about the commotion. Inside the palace, his 3 grown daughters had also been roused and gathered in the great hall. Speaking in a croaking old woman's voice, Medea declared that Artemis wanted to reward Peleus for his devotion, setting the stage for the next phase of her cunning plan. Medea told Peleus that the goddess Artemis had heard of his tragic loss and wished to make him young again, so he could have another son and heir. Peleus was skeptical and scornfully asked why he should believe her. Medea then amazed him by spinning around and magically transforming herself from an old woman into a young woman, proving the power of Artemis. Peleus, impressed and eager, asked what he had to do to become young again. Medea instructed him to watch carefully as she prepared her ritual. She called for water and fire while producing a gleaming curved knife. The old ram tied to the cart protested weakly as Medea dragged it over and with a flourish slaughtered it, cutting it into 13 pieces, proclaiming 13 as a magic number beloved by goddesses and sorceresses alike. She threw the pieces into a bubbling cauldron and began chanting and waving her hands dramatically, invoking Artemis. The hall filled with the aroma of boiling meat, and Peleus was captivated by the spectacle. Then, with a flourish, Medea leaned over the cauldron, partially covering it and the statue of Artemis with her cloak, and reached inside the steam to produce a lively young lamb, holding it up triumphantly. The audience applauded, convinced that they had witnessed the ram's rejuvenation, unaware that Medea had secretly hidden the young lamb inside the hollow statue beforehand. Medea then turned to Peleus's daughters and said she would now rejuvenate their father, instructing the slaves to replenish the fire and water. Peleus eagerly laid down on a couch, closed his eyes, and relaxed. Medea removed the stopper from a small bottle and applied drops of a sleeping potion to his eyelids, assuring him that upon waking, he would be young and handsome again, free of pain, wrinkles, and grey hair. Peleus fell asleep quickly. Medea then handed a knife to Evadne, Peleus's eldest daughter, emphasizing again that 13 was the magic number. Evadne exchanged nervous looks with her sisters, Alcestis and Amphinomen, who were uneasy and worried. Medea warned that Artemis did not show mercy to those who disobeyed her, reminding Evadne that Peleus felt nothing while asleep. Evadne took the knife, and Medea encouraged her gently, saying that if she loved her father, she would do as instructed. She lifted one of Peleus's lifeless arms, letting it flop onto his leg with a slap, as a reminder that he was unconscious and would not feel pain. Medea urged the daughters to act quickly, promising that the sooner they began, the sooner their father would regain his youth and strength. Evadne, guided by Medea's command and invoking the will of Artemis, took a deep breath and plunged the knife into her father Peleus's stomach. Alcestis turned away in distress, unable to participate, while Amphinomen called for another knife to help dissect their father's body. Together, the two daughters cut Peleus into 13 pieces, dropping each one into the bubbling cauldron. Though Alcestis refused to join in, she did not stop them, believing that their father would soon rise renewed and youthful from the boiling stew, reborn like a phoenix. Once the last piece, Peleus's head, was placed in the cauldron, Medea explained that another part of the ritual was necessary for human rejuvenation. She led the daughters in a solemn torchlit procession to the palace roof to invoke Artemis, goddess of the moon. Below, curious slaves and guards who had abandoned their posts gathered around the cauldron, watching Peleus's severed head shift in the greasy grey mixture, waiting in vain for him to be restored to life. Meanwhile, on the beach, the Argonauts saw the torches flickering atop the palace roof, the signal they awaited. Armed and ready, they stormed into Iolcus, meeting little resistance at the gates or within the palace halls. Inside, they found a sorrowful scene. Peleus's daughters, weeping and remorseful, had just realized Medea's cruel deception. They had unwittingly murdered their own father. Even the sudden appearance of their brother Acastus, long believed dead, could not ease their grief and guilt. The palace guards had fled to spread news of Peleus's strange death, and Medea had vanished without a trace. Amid the sisters' wailing and the ruined remains of the tyrant king, Jason took possession of the throne of Iolcus. As he ascended the podium, memories flooded back to his first time in the palace. A young man eager for adventure and driven to avenge the wrongs Peleus had inflicted on his family, despite feeling sympathy for Peleus's daughters and for Acastus, whom he had come to respect over their long journey. Jason knew that justice had been served. Sitting awkwardly on the cold throne, He surveyed the vast marble floor and pictured the cruel moment when Peleus had seized his baby brother from their mother's arms. He wondered where the infant had met his brutal death and felt his heart harden with a fierce hatred for the man who had betrayed him and destroyed his family so mercilessly. This hatred was tempered only by the grim satisfaction of revenge finally fulfilled. If only there could have been a happy ending for the weary Argonauts, with a triumphant homecoming and grand celebration in Colchis. But instead, their victory was met with horror and outrage over Medea's brutal way of disposing of Peleus. Acastus, Peleus's son, vowed solemnly to avenge his father's death, his eyes heavy with sorrow even as he spoke of duty and revenge. Soon, Acastus and his sisters gathered Peleus' supporters and many townsfolk who refused to accept Jason as king. Within hours, an angry mob surrounded the palace, demanding Jason surrender the throne. Jason, saddened by their quick forgetfulness, understood this was no time for regrets, as the mob threatened to storm the palace. The Argonauts, barricaded inside the throne room, were heavily outnumbered and had no choice but to flee. But fighting their way out against furious citizens wielding flaming torches and clashing weapons seemed impossible. Then an unexpected answer appeared in the form of an ancient serving woman who had silently witnessed Medea's deadly act and Jason's claim to the throne. Now, shrouded in black, she stepped forward and softly reminded Jason that she had rescued him once before. Jason was surprised, certain he had never seen her before, but she explained that she had attended his mother at his birth and had been entrusted with taking him away from the palace to Chiron's cave in the mountains when he was just a baby, crying loudly. Though Jason was unsure what this had to do with their current danger, the woman continued, revealing a secret underground tunnel that led from the palace to beyond the city gates. She had smuggled the infant Jason out through that passage, fighting through spiderwebs and darkness. Suddenly, a loud crash from the courtyard shattered the moment. Lynceus reported the gates had been broken down, and the mob was advancing. Shaken from her memories, the old woman urged that the tunnel still existed and was their only chance of escape. Jason hesitated to trust her, but Medea, impatient and desperate, insisted they had no time to waste and must rely on the woman. As the sounds of angry voices reached a roar and an axe smashed through the throne room door, Jason urged urgency. The old woman hurried to a small door in the corner, opened it to reveal a narrow flight of steps descending into darkness, and instructed them to go down as far as possible to a storeroom. The Argonauts prepared to flee through the ancient hidden passage, the last hope to escape the furious mob and the crumbling palace they had once hoped to claim as their triumph. Jason and the Argonauts escaped the angry mob by following the directions of an old serving woman who led them to a secret entrance beneath a row of huge storage jars marked with a serpent. Sliding the jar back, they lifted a flagstone to reveal a narrow tunnel, and Jason was the first to leap down the steps, followed closely by the others. The old woman slammed the door behind them and sealed the entrance, just as Acastus burst into the room, sword raised, only to find the ancient woman smiling faintly. While Acastus and the mob searched the palace in vain, Jason and the Argonauts made their way through the dusty tunnel, unnoticed, as a storage jar remained out of place and a few footprints marked the ground. Once outside the city, the crew instinctively returned to their ship, the Argo, but the time had come for them to part ways. Slowly and sadly, the heroes dispersed. Zetes and Calais flew away through the morning mist. Castor and Polydeuces walked along the shore, and Orpheus retrieved his lyre before bidding farewell to Jason and Medea to follow the twins. Even Atalanta, the brave warrior, looked close to tears as she decided to seek new adventures and hunt for Heracles. Jason and Medea sailed the Argo to Orchomenos in Boeotia, where the Golden Fleece had once been part of a great rescue, and there they hung the fleece in Zeus's temple for all to see. Afterward, they sailed to Corinth, where, with the help of local fishermen, they hauled the Argo ashore and dedicated it to Poseidon. Finally, Jason fulfilled a promise made months earlier in Colchis and married Medea. They settled in Corinth, where Medea's royal lineage gave her a claim to the throne since her father, King Aetes, had once ruled there. The previous ruler appointed by Aetes had died without heirs, so the people accepted Medea as queen and Jason as king. Jason at last had the chance to wear the crown Chiron had foretold long ago, though it was not the one he had risked so much to earn. Despite the lack of fanfare, stories of Jason and the Argonauts' daring adventures spread far and wide, and Jason became a celebrated hero. For a time, Jason and Medea were happy, especially when they welcomed twin sons. However, after 10 years of marriage, Jason fell deeply in love with a young princess named Colchis, daughter of King Creon of Thebes. In doing so, he forgot the promises made to Medea when she had saved him in Colchis, and neglected the countless times she had helped the Argonauts on their perilous journey. The tale of their lives was far from a fairy tale ending. Jason forgot the vows he had made to Medea on their wedding day, forgot she was the mother of his sons and his faithful wife who had saved his life many times, and instead he wanted her out of his life so he could marry Colchis, the young princess of Thebes. Medea was furious, heartbroken, and filled with rage, but she was also clever. Still deeply in love with Jason, she pretended to accept the divorce calmly, even smiling sweetly at Colchis, and asking Jason to let her stay in the palace one more day to pack her things. But instead of packing, she prepared her revenge. The next day, as Jason and Colchis were discussing their wedding plans in the throne room, one of Jason's sons brought a gift from Medea, a beautiful robe and a golden crown. Colchis eagerly opened the package, admired the gifts, and tried them on at once. But as soon as the robe touched her skin and the crown rested on her head, she began to scream in agony. The poisons Medea had hidden in the fabric and metal were eating into her flesh. Colchis tried to rip the robe off, but it clung tightly to her, and the crown burned deadened into her scalp. The robe then burst into flames, turning Colchis into a burning torch as she staggered around, setting everything on fire. Jason tried to help her but was blasted back by the heat. The throne room erupted in flames as Colchis collapsed to the floor, completely consumed by fire. Her father, King Creon, rushed in but was caught in the blaze and perished. Servants screamed and ran for water, but it was too late. The fire spread through the sun-dried palace, destroying everything: rooms, staircases, furniture, and people. Jason, trapped with no secret tunnel, no help, and no hope, stumbled through the thick smoke, flames closing in, his hands raised to shield his face. He cried out to the gods, Athene, Zeus, Hera, but no answer came. Far above on Mount Olympus, Hera sighed at the sound of his voice. She remembered the kindness and respect Jason had once shown her when he carried her across the river in disguise, but she also remembered how cruelly he had treated Medea, the woman who had done everything for him. She was no longer sure he deserved saving, and Jason was left in the burning palace, surrounded by fire, betrayed by his own choices, and abandoned by the gods he had once called upon. Jason was choking in the thick black smoke, blinded and overwhelmed by the unbearable heat. his skin burning, his body barely able to move. As he struggled along the wall, just when it felt like he would fall unconscious and be consumed by the fire, his fingers found a small opening in the stone. Without thinking, he dragged himself into the hole, whispering thanks to Hera, who had finally answered his desperate cries. He dropped out of the palace, his burned feet hitting the ground as he collapsed, coughing and gasping for air. Then came a thunderous explosion, and through the smoke, Jason looked up to see Medea soaring into the sky in a golden chariot drawn by flying dragons, laughing wildly as she disappeared into the clouds. Jason, half dead and broken, lay helpless on the scorched earth. After Medea fled, stories spread about her fate. Some said she flew to Thebes and tried to hide with Heracles, but the people drove her away when they learned she had killed their king. Others claimed she went to Athens and married King Aegeus, only to be banished again when she tried to poison his son, Theseus. Whatever the truth, Medea never found peace. Her love for Jason remained, twisted by betrayal into rage, and even to her dying day, she swore she still loved him. As for Jason, though Hera had saved him from death, the gods had turned away from him after he broke his promises to Medea. His body slowly healed, but the pain never left him, and neither did the scars. He walked with great difficulty, wandering from city to city, never truly welcomed, never again finding happiness. He spent days searching through the ashes of the palace, desperate to find some sign of his lost children, but nothing remained. Grief and regret followed him wherever he went. In his old age he returned to Corinth, though it was now a different place, filled with strangers who did not know his name. Limping through the streets, he finally made his way down to the beach, where the wreck of the Argo still rested, broken and decaying on the shore. Jason sat beside it, staring at his scarred old feet and then at the sea, remembering the glory days when the ship raced across the waves with her sails high, with Lynceus at the prow, Tiphys at the helm, and all the Argonauts full of hope and courage. Now, those days were gone. All that remained was an old man, forgotten by the world, sitting in the shadow of the ship that had once carried him to greatness. Jason craned his neck to look back at the rotting remains of the Argo, now a lifeless wreck on the beach, its sail reduced to a few torn scraps clinging to the mast. He lay back on the sand, closed his eyes, and let the memories come. As sleep pulled him under, the past returned in vivid images. He saw the fierce warrior queen of Lemnos with her triumphant smile, Atalanta's impatient glare as she pushed the crew to continue, Heracles weeping for his lost companion Hylas, King Cyzicus warmly welcoming them to his doomed wedding feast, blind Phineus crying out against the Harpies, and Circe shimmering with magic on her enchanted island. Then came Medea, radiant and mysterious, standing in a mountain pool beneath a rushing waterfall, only for her face to vanish behind the terrifying vision of a massive dragon lunging at him. Next came the fire-breathing bulls, their flames licking his feet, the thunderous smash of the clashing rocks, and the high screeching of the deadly Stymphalian birds and harpies soaring into the sky. In his dream, he heard the soft, familiar voice of Chiron, repeating the old prophecy. Fame and glory, a long, long journey, pain and tragedy, and a chance to wear a crown, the words echoing gently like waves on the shore. As Jason sank deeper into dreams of monsters and memories, he did not hear the warning creak from the ship behind him. He never saw the prow of the Argo, carved from the sacred oak of Dodona, a gift from the goddess Athene, splinter and fall. Nor did he feel it crash onto his head, killing him instantly At that moment, Pluto sent Hermes to gently lift Jason's soul from his final dream and guide him down into the underworld. There, on the other side of the river Styx, waiting with smiles and open arms, stood his two little sons, ready to welcome their father home at last.